Hey, what's up you guys? My name's Tyler Rugge. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be showing you the 5 easiest ways to kill a crested gecko. I'm not going to be showing you, I'm going to be telling you, I guess. Pinnacle is sweating nervously. This is Pinnacle. He's our special guest today. Look how wonderful he is. We're going to be telling you, it's like tutorial, how to kill a crested gecko. I'm going to be telling you the 5 most common ways that I see people killing crested geckos, or just the biggest mistakes people make that lead to the death of crested geckos. So crested geckos are by far one of the easiest pet reptiles you could possibly keep. But with that being said, they are still absolutely killable. There's still mistakes that you can make that can lead to their death, and a lot of these mistakes are things that you wouldn't necessarily maybe think of or think would lead to them dying very quickly or lead to them not being healthy. Yeah, I've just been in crested gecko Facebook groups and seeing a lot of the common mistakes people make over and over again. I'm going to be sharing them with you so that hopefully you don't have to make the same mistakes. So we've been breeding crested geckos for a few years now. We've raised probably over 100 babies. We have like 100 babies currently that we are raising, with more hatching. So needless to say, we definitely have experience with raising crested geckos and have had a lot of trial and error with different methods of caring for them. And I just have a pretty good idea of what does and doesn't work for a lot of geckos. So hopefully you guys find this video to be helpful. For the very first one, we're gonna start off with probably my most controversial take of this entire video, and maybe of my entire career. Some of you guys are, I know, gonna disagree with me, but hear me out. One of the biggest mistakes I see people make is putting their crested gecko in too large of an enclosure. Yes, you heard me say too large of an enclosure. Now don't get me wrong, of course, you guys know this. I'm all about enrichment. I'm all about giving reptiles large enclosures and not just sticking to the bare minimum. But crested geckos are just one of the cases where you can actually give them too much. Now specifically, the most common thing I see happening is people will buy a crested gecko, usually a hatchling or a really young juvenile. They immediately stick them in an 18 by 18 by 24 enclosure, which is like the standard for an adult crested gecko. And then they're like, why isn't my gecko eating? So here's the thing with crested geckos. They aren't the brightest creatures. Sorry, Pinnacle. They're not like the smartest things on the planet, you know? In order for them to find their food, they pretty much have to stumble upon it and be like, oh look, what is that? I'm stepping in my food. And if you give them a huge enclosure, it's a lot harder for them to find their food. And for whatever reason, they just don't eat very much if you give them too large of an enclosure a lot of the time. And I've seen people in groups and stuff who will keep their crested gecko in a huge enclosure, 18 by 18 by 24 or 36 or whatever it may be. Just a really big enclosure for the size of the gecko. And then, you know, their gecko is like 2 years old and it has hardly grown at all the entire time they've had it. And they're like, why isn't my gecko eating? There's a very good chance it's just because the enclosure is too big. So for like a hatchling crested gecko, what we do with our hatchlings is we keep them in a 6-quart tub, which seems really small, I know, but for a really small gecko, you can really provide them everything they need in a small tub like that. And we've just found that when keeping them in a 6-quart tub, they eat consistently and grow very well. So would we rather put them in a huge enclosure where they're not eating and growing? Or would we rather put them in a small tub temporarily until they are growing and eating consistently? You know what I'm saying? Which one realistically do you think is better for the gecko? Probably the smaller tub. So we put hatchlings in a 6-quart tub. Once they're eating consistently and they're growing and they put a little bit of size on them, then you can move them into something a little bit bigger. I wouldn't necessarily go straight into an 18 by 18 by 24. You could go with like a 16-quart tub or a 12 by 12 by 18. And then once they're actually like closer to their adult size, I would move them into an 18 by 18 by 24. But at any rate, if you're noticing your gecko isn't eating very well, I would definitely at least try downgrading them and see if it helps, because a lot of the time it does. And it's better to downgrade them so that they're eating consistently and they're more healthy than to try and give them just a really big enclosure, you know? And sometimes this is also the case with adults as well. Not as often, but we've definitely had a couple geckos, and one in particular, Kala, our lily white. Some of you guys may know him because he's wonderful and iconic. He's tried to kill himself before via starvation because he was in an 18 by 18 by 24, would not eat. Mind you, this 18 by 18 by 24, decked out with plants, you know, foliage, things to climb on. It wasn't just like a big open bare enclosure. He wasn't just insecure in there. He had everything he needed. He just wouldn't eat. So we downgrade him into a little tub, immediately starts eating. Put him back into an 18 by 18 by 24, stops eating again. And then we moved him into a 12 by 12 by 18, and now he eats and he's healthy and he's doing fine. So for whatever reason, he just doesn't do well in the bigger enclosure. And between keeping him in 18 by 18 by 24 and having him not eat very much and be very skinny, and having him in a little bit smaller of an enclosure where he eats like normal and is completely healthy, we're obviously going to choose the smaller enclosure, even though that's not necessarily ideally how we would keep most of our geckos. That's just what works best for him. So if you have a gecko that's not eating, just try downgrading them and see if it helps. If it does, and you can get them eating consistently, then you can try upgrading them again. For whatever reason, some geckos just do better in smaller enclosures. So it's just something to think about. The next biggest mistake I see people make with crested geckos probably is with their humidity, because crested geckos, obviously, they like humidity to some degree. They're an animal that needs to be misted regularly, but I would say the most common mistake I see people make with their humidity is having it be way too high all of the time. But there's also some cases where I've seen people keep them way too dry. And you need to have a good middle ground, and what I would recommend is misting them pretty decently at nighttime. Make sure everything's pretty well saturated, but then don't mist them again until the enclosure has dried out for the most part. So we'll typically mist at nighttime, and then at night when the lights are off, enclosure stays pretty damp, and then in the morning the lights turn on, and then all during the day the enclosure is kind of drying out, and then at nighttime we mist again. So there's going to be a lot of fluctuation in humidity. They need a humidity spike, but they also need it to drop as well. It can't just be consistently dry or consistently really damp all the time. There has to be a good middle ground. And how often you actually should be misting will depend on the enclosure you're using, the substrate, like climate of your home, like the ventilation, and just all of those will play a factor in how quickly the enclosure actually dries out. But just make sure it's drying out a bit before you go ahead and mist it again. Don't just keep it like sopping wet all the time or really, really dry all the time. And that leads us to the next mistake that I see people make very often, which kind of goes hand in hand with the humidity, and that is lack of ventilation. This is typically an issue when people are keeping their smaller gecko in a tub, because in tubs, they don't dry out as quickly if you don't have enough ventilation, obviously. So in like a screen enclosure, like an Exoterra or a Zoomed, if you have one of those, they already have a ton of ventilation because there's usually frontal ventilation by the doors, and there's also the entire screen top. But with a tub, you need to drill holes, and you just need to make sure you're putting enough holes in there that there's enough ventilation that if you missed it at nighttime, that by the next night, it's not going to still be wet, basically. So what we do is we use a hole saw and drill a big hole in the front of the tub, and then we put a round vent in there. And then for the tubs we have in the rack systems, we just use the vent because there's technically a little gap between the top of the rack and the top of the tub where, you know, there's going to be some air ventilation. So pretty much the whole top is ventilated anyway. So we find that that's enough. But if you're using a tub with a lid, then you also want to put ventilation holes across like two sides of the tub towards the top, and or also add ventilation holes to the lid. You might need to play around with how many ventilation holes you actually need to put in. What are we at now? Number 4? So for number 4, I think this is probably the easiest way to kill a crested gecko, aside from like bludgeoning them with a hammer. They're just not very tolerant at all with heat. I would never recommend letting their enclosure get over 80 degrees. Now technically, they can withstand a little bit more than 80 degrees Fahrenheit, but I would not let it get over 80 because that just starts to get a little bit dangerous for them. So you need to pay really close attention to the temperature of the room that you're keeping your enclosure in. And you also want to pay really close attention to the actual temperature of inside the enclosure, especially if you have like LEDs and a UVB on it, because that's going to add a little bit of extra heat towards the top of the enclosure. I would highly recommend getting a temp gun, because then you can just check the temperature all over the enclosure. I would make sure the top of the enclosure, again, doesn't get much more than 80 degrees. But as long as the bottom of the enclosure is staying nice and cool, like in the lower 70s or so, then you should be good, because the gecko will have a place to go and cool down if it needs to. But I would say what happens almost the most often is some sort of freak accident where the entire room just overheats. And maybe it's because the power went out during the summer and you have no AC, or if you're like not home and just something happens and the room gets really warm because you're not monitoring the temperature properly. It really doesn't take long for it to be fatal for the gecko if the room overheats. So make sure you're just really on top of that and have a backup plan. If the room gets hot or you have somewhere cooler to put the gecko, make sure you have like a portable AC unit. Have a thermometer in the room that you can monitor like from your phone, and maybe it'll send you a notification when it reaches a certain temperature. Another thing, just while we're talking about overheating, do not give your crested gecko a heat source. Just don't do that. They don't need a heat lamp. They don't need a heat pad, none of that. Some people will say that you should give them a heat source so that they can like thermoregulate and they have the option to bask. But I'm just gonna go ahead and say, don't do that unless your house is like abnormally cold and you actually need a heat source to heat up the enclosure to be like in the 70s. But if you're gonna use a heat source, just be very, very careful, because again, they cannot handle like much more than 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's very easy to overheat the enclosure. Again, if you have other lighting on the enclosure like UVB and LEDs, those are naturally gonna produce a little bit of heat and create a thermal gradient in the enclosure anyway. And then last but not least, I don't think this is as common. This is probably the least common of everything I've talked about, and it might surprise some of you. And that is an imbalanced diet. Obviously, it's not surprising that giving an animal not a properly balanced diet would kill them, but it might be surprising because crested geckos are probably the easiest thing ever to feed, because there's crested gecko diets readily available that you just mix up and it's already everything they need to survive, and you just give it to them, and then also maybe give them some live insects here and there, and that's literally all they need. But where people go wrong is when they try to make their own homemade gecko food and give it to their gecko, because it's not properly balanced for what they need nutritionally. Nutrition-wise, they have specific requirements that they need to meet to be healthy, and if you're just mixing random fruits and supplements that you bought at the grocery store, it's not gonna go over very well, I can almost guarantee you. In the wild, they eat a very large variety of things, and even the fruits they eat in the wild are very just nutritionally different than the fruits that you buy at the grocery store. Wild fruits are typically higher in protein and much lower in sugar, and then the stuff you buy at the grocery store is basically the opposite. It's like they basically take away all the nutrients and just pump it with sugar so that it tastes good for us, which is great, but it's not great for a gecko. Yeah, don't try to make your own crested gecko food. Just stick to the Pangea, the Rapashi, all of that stuff, which you can buy at celestialexotics.net, which is my online pet store, which will be linked down below, and there's free shipping, so make sure you just buy it there. So yeah, those are all the ways that people kill their crested gecko. Don't do those things. If you guys found this video to be helpful, if you did, make sure you give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel if you guys are new here, and Pinnacle and I will see you guys in the next video.